The immortal words of Dr. Martin Luther King still echo in our ears. I have a dream today. They were a clarion call for what became one of the great movements of the modern world. It was all about an extraordinary idea, the conviction that all should be treated, not according to ethnicity, wealth, or social class, but according to the content of their character. Of course, Dr. King didn't invent the idea of social justice. A century and a half ago, Abraham Lincoln thunderously declared that all people are created equal. But he didn't invent such ideas either, nor did the framers of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Don't you suppose it would be helpful to figure out how and when this curious notion of human rights originated? The truth is, Martin Luther King, like India's social justice warrior, Mohandas Gandhi, borrowed extensively from the Bible, specifically from the legacy of the great Hebrew prophets of old. In fact, we might make a case that the entire concept of social justice, as we think of it today, is directly rooted in the ancient Israelite prophetic class. And those same prophets are not to be taken for granted. They were, in fact, about as revolutionary as the wheel. Think about it. The ancient Greeks had their soothsayers and shamans. The ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians had their fortune tellers. But only Israel had prophets in the true sense of the word. One immediate issue we might raise is whether there would have been a Jewish people at all without the prophets. After all, the Jews were a conquered people, having been vanquished by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE. Their great city of Jerusalem was burned, their temple destroyed, and their leadership was taken into captivity in faraway Babylon. What normally happens to conquered peoples? They ordinarily become extinct, intermingling with their conquerors, as cultures change and evolve in new directions. The Jews were one ancient people who did not assimilate but survived against all odds, with their own culture intact. Why? They must have had some powerful motivating factor that kept them alive and distinct. They no longer had a land, they no longer had an army, but they did have an idea. It was an idea as powerful as any imagined. Of course, it was the Israelites who gave us the concept of one God, monotheism, but even that wasn't sufficient reason why this people should survive. So what if this people had only a single God? What if this were a cruel, vengeful God, a God of wrath rather than mercy? Arguably, it was the Israelite prophets who at a critical moment in time transformed the very idea of God into an emblem of transcendent compassion. In the end, what we have is not just monotheism. It's properly called ethical monotheism. And that made all the difference. It gave a conquered people a reason to survive. That said, there are yet other angles to consider. For example, many contemporary scholars would go as far as to say that the books of Moses, that is the Torah, assumed their final edited form after the earliest classical Israelite prophets. In other words, the prophets, who abruptly appeared during the period of the monarchy, beginning in the 700s BCE, wrote at a time when there were only bits and pieces of the books of Moses floating around. When all 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, were finally edited and set in place, they became a counterbalance to the fiery voices of the prophets. First came the prophetic visionaries, then the priestly institutionalizers who gave us law and order. It's only a theory, but it does seem that the prophets represent a system of checks and balances against both kings and priests.
Perhaps we ought to start our inquiry with the word itself. What does prophet mean? Of course, it's a Hebrew word, pronounced navi. It doesn't mean one who foretells the future. A navi isn't God's soothsayer. We should properly understand it as meaning spokesman, not a foreteller, but a forth-teller. And on that score, very much like Dr. Martin Luther King. And that means that most people who automatically fancy the prophets as tellers of the future have got it all wrong. That's not to say they never delivered messages of things to come. That just wasn't their primary mission. The divine commission was straightforward enough, even if it often sounded like mission impossible. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is to stand up on behalf of the weak and the oppressed, to fight corruption in high places. Not surprisingly, most of the prophets weren't exactly thrilled with Mission Impossible, and were inclined to ask, couldn't you have chosen somebody else? So that in the final analysis, the truest characteristic of a prophet was reluctance. In a sense, Israel's greatest prophets, the likes of Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, came out of nowhere. Their appearance was as unexpected as it was sudden. There was, however, an earlier class of Israelite prophets, not nearly as well known, who arrived on the scene centuries earlier. These were, in fact, of the shamanic variety, wandering to and fro across the land and delivering oracular pronouncements, often in an altered state of consciousness. We might call them ecstatic prophets and consider them somewhat akin to the Greek oracles. Moses is called a prophet, and so is Samuel. When the people asked for a king, it was Samuel who told them what would happen.
He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plough his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards, and give them to his servants. He will take the 10th of your grain and of your vineyards, and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants, and the best of your young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your flocks, and you shall be his bondservants.
We're told that the young man Samuel anoints to be Israel's first king doesn't really want the job, and wanders off to join a troop of these early prophets. He's later found rolling around on the ground naked, and the saying arises, "Is Saul too among the prophets?" The last of this breed of early prophets is a venerable character known as Eliyahu. We know him as Elijah, who stood up to the despotic king Ahab and his queen Jezebel, and orchestrated the slaughter of a whole host of the priests of Baal. It all went down on Mount Carmel in northern Israel, where a monastery marks the spot of the site on which Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a demonstration of who was the real God. Sacrifices were placed on an altar to Baal and on another to the God of Israel. The pagan prophet's ecstatic appeals to Baal to kindle the wood on his altar were met with silence, but Elijah's prayers were answered by a fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the stones of the altar itself, the earth, and even the water in the trench. Under Elijah's direction, the impassioned Israelites went on to slay the priests and prophets of Baal, and a sudden rain brought an end to the drought which had been plaguing the land. Elijah may well represent the last gasp of this early prophetic movement. As he later flees from Jezebel's wrath, he seeks shelter on the so-called mountain of God. Multiple signs appear: a mighty wind, an earthquake, and fire. But the divine presence is in none of them. Only then does he hear a still, small voice. This is how Elijah encounters God. The essence of this narrative is that this God, the God of Israel, is not to be confused with any created thing. This God is other, completely separate from the physical world. It's a powerful philosophic statement. Prior to being taken up into the heavens, Elijah passed or dropped his mantle to his sidekick Elisha, who purportedly performed even more miracles than his mentor. But the wandering band of ecstatic prophets to which these illustrious characters belonged slowly petered out. It would take another century and a half before a completely new breed of prophets would arise. Prophets who didn't just deliver oracles, but who wrote entire books featuring some of the most powerful prose and poetry ever written. They would also make a new contribution to human civilization, for instead of praising their own society and culture with unquestioned support, they would turn established decorum on its head. For the first time in history, they would lead a social campaign, questioning their own people. They would teach the importance of self-criticism, of urging society by example to make the world a better place, of bequeathing to future generations a world that is better than they found it. And the rest is history.